Okay. Assalam Alaykum, Embrace Family, and Jazakallah here for joining us for Chapter 5 of the Autobiography of Malcolm X. In tonight's chapter called Harlemite, we learn about Malcolm's first trip to Harlem, New York, and how attached he became to the place and the people. So through a friend of Ella's, who we learned about before as his stepsister who he lived with in Boston, Malcolm gets a job on a railroad car. And even though he thought Ella just got him the job to get him away from Sophia, who was the white woman he was seeing, he took the job with the hope of eventually being on a route to New York. And this was a place he'd heard about and dreamed of going because of the excitement it seemed to hold. And he continued to see Sophia when he returned home. So if keeping Malcolm away from her was Ella's intention, it didn't work. So initially, he's on a route to Washington, D.C. as quote-unquote fourth cook, which he understood to mean dishwasher, but he didn't mind at all because he was willing to do whatever it took to get to where he wanted to go, which was New York. So while in D.C., even though Malcolm seemed to like the tougher neighborhoods, even D.C. was too much for him. There were areas that he was just flat out warned were outright dangerous, and he avoided those places. He was also shocked and saddened to see the conditions that black people there were living in inside of our nation's capital. And he said it was the worst he had ever seen anywhere, he had been up until that point. So he gets the opportunity to fill in for the sandwich man on the New York route. And once he visited Harlem, he said there was no way that guy was getting his job back, right? And he made sure that his sales were off the charts. In Harlem, he gravitated to the places he'd heard so much about, like the Savoy Ballroom, the Apollo Theater, bars where celebrities hung out. And there was one place in particular that he took to that was a restaurant and bar called Small's Paradise. Malcolm relays in vivid detail the places he visited and those he saw. And he is telling his story and drawing the reader into that moment, into the moment that he's describing, which I personally think is a great way of storytelling. However, he also makes sure he lets the reader know that he, while he is giving that true picture, he's also not fond of all the behaviors, by inserting things like, especially after seeing the Harlem nightlife, he says, in another 2 years, I could have given them all lessons, but that night I was mesmerized. This world was where I belonged. On that night, I started my way to becoming a Harlemite. I was going to become one of the most depraved, parasitical hustlers among New York's 8 million people, 4 million of whom work, and the other 4 million of whom live off them. So, he's basically letting us know that he wasn't proud of this time in his life. He also says, the drape of the end cut of a zoot suit showed to the best advantage if you were tall, and I was over 6 feet. My conch was fire red. I was really a clown, but my ignorance made me think I was sharp. So again, pointing to the fact that he wasn't proud of this time in his life. And he was such a spectacle that when he went back home to Lansing to visit his family, he literally caused a car accident. He said it was a minor accident, but he still caused a car accident. And he even signed an autograph while he was there. He signed it Harlem Red. So he was riding high there in Lansing, in Harlem, and in Boston, where he could show off Sophia to his railroad buddies. That he said the only thing that brought him down to earth was when, he went to see his mom, at the state hospital or mental institution, which undoubtedly had to be sobering. So we've been talking about the life lessons that Malcolm got that helped to shape him into who he became. And one situation that happened on the train shows Malcolm's ability to think quickly on his feet by avoiding a potentially dangerous or bad situation. So he was in the railroad car when a drunken white soldier stood up to fight him. And he convinced him that he had on too many clothes, like up top, the coat and all that stuff. So, the guy starts stripping away like the coat, and Malcolm kept saying, you still got too many clothes on. And so he kept taking it off until he was completely from the waist up, had nothing on. And everyone in the railroad car is laughing at him, at the soldier, and another soldier finally set him down. And so what Malcolm said about that is he said, I never would forget that I couldn't have whipped that white man as badly with a club as I had with my mind. So certainly a lesson Malcolm took with him from that situation is to use his intellect instead of his might to outwit an opponent. So Malcolm had begun to stop taking his job on the railroad car seriously at all. He would show up drunk or high, he would curse at the passengers, etc., and he ends up losing his job. He then begins to work as a waiter at Small's Paradise, where he completely changes his work ethic because it was a place he actually enjoyed being. So he was 17 at this time and learned about working well with others. He says of the daytime waiter he relieved, thanks to him, I learned very quickly dozens of little things that could really ingratiate a new waiter with the cooks and bartenders. Both of these, depending on how they liked the waiter, could make his job miserable or pleasant, and I meant to become indispensable. Inside a week, I had succeeded with both. So he was clearly able to think strategically and persuade others to get the outcome he wanted. So Malcolm was also a very good listener and had the ability to connect with people. And while his ability to listen and connect with others was surely an asset, I have to wonder if the lessons that he got from some of the customers were a little too sinister for an impressionable young man. So remember, again, he had just turned 17. And he says, every day I listened rapidly to customers who felt like talking. It all added to my education. My ears soaked it up like sponges. So while there were some of those conversations that were a little more benign, like, around how Harlem came about and how Black people, the history of Black people in New York, there were also, those conversations where he picked up things that probably weren't beneficial. So he says, I was thus schooled well by experts in such hustles as the numbers, pimping, con games of many kinds, peddling dope, and thievery of all sorts, including armed robbery. So while there were some positive leadership traits that he was able to gain from his experiences during this time, strategic thinking, effective listening and communication, connecting and working well with others, persuading others, developing a strong work ethic, etc., these lessons that he got from these hustlers undoubtedly contributed to his Hoodlum years, inshallah. So that's all of the review that we have, that I have for you guys tonight. And inshallah, we can go ahead and open it up for our discussion portion, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu Alaikum.